And so I think I started recording. And the agenda tonight is basically I'm going to give a few introductory remarks. Vice President Hutchinson is going to add his perspective as well on, the history up to this point and where are we going next. And then we're going to hear from staff just presenting what is Assembly Bill 1912 and what are the metrics that staff are suggesting for the equity impact analysis this year. And then we'll have a lot of time for Q&A and feedback from the community. And we were just saying before this, we don't have to end this right at 7 o'clock. We can go a little later if folks want to. And then we'll just wrap it up and wish everyone a good night. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I just wanted to start just with more of a historical context. This is the enrollment in Oakland, both district schools and charter schools, because the rise in charter schools definitely had a big impact on our city. But you can see here, I think what's really noticeable when you look at this graph is you see that red line declining, which is African-American students, and the green line kind of increasing, which is Latinx students. And what you don't see on this slide, but I have on the other slide, is the vast increase in the charter school impact on our city. And so, I think we've seen big change in Oakland over the past 20 years, both demographic change, how our schools are organized. And there's big change coming because change is the only, change is a constant. And so I think in that context and in some of the context that's been raised around school closures and the impact of them, there were a whole series of school closures when we were taken over by the state in the early part of the 2000s. And then some more in around 2012 under Tony Smith that really had a negative impact on our town. And I think we're still feeling the impact of this. Sorry, my neighbor is moving furniture. I hope you can't hear that. And I think we're still reaping the whirlwind from that. And it's created a lot of lack of trust, a lot of upset over, the past and what happened. But I also think that part of what's going on is there's been tremendous forces, bigger social forces in Oakland, gentrification, displacement that have pushed African-American families particularly out of the city in a really terrible and painful way. And that's, I think, the biggest factor that's influencing that steep decline that you see over the past 20 years. And so that's just the context that OUSD is trying to respond to in the best way that it can, in the most anti-racist way that I think we can figure out together. But it is a really extreme situation that we've seen in Oakland over the past 20 years that's caused this just drastic decline in the African-American population in Oakland that's really impacted our city. Can you go to the next slide, please? This one is really showing charter versus district. And so the upper line, you see the district schools, and the lower line, you see charters. And so the story over, from 2000 to about 2017, you started with almost no charter schools in the district. And then by 2017-18, there were 44 charter schools in Oakland. Since 2017-18, which, kind of by coincidence is when Dr. Johnson Trammell became our superintendent, you see a different dynamic where actually both charter schools and district schools are facing declining enrollment. And that's not only in Oakland, but really across the state, as there's been demographic changes. A lot of systems, whether it's this district, San Francisco, LA Unified, a lot of districts are seeing declining enrollment due to demographics. And so there's actually over 4,000 fewer students, both district and charter, than 5 years ago. And so in the district, it's about, if you look at these two numbers, it's about 3,000 fewer students. In the charters, it's about 1,500 fewer. And so combined, it's 4,400 fewer students. And there's also fewer schools overall. There's 10 fewer district schools and 5 fewer charter schools than in 2017. So that's a real big change and a shift but I think a lot of people are still functioning on the kind of charters are growing and district is shrinking, but now it's actually both of us are shrinking. Can you go to the next slide, please? So just in those past 6 years, from 2017 to now, those 15 fewer schools, how did that happen? It's a combination of mergers. So when you talk about mergers, you think of Elmhurst United, which is the middle school in East Oakland, Lockwood, which used to be Q's and Futures, Highland, Rudsdale was two different programs, a newcomer program and a continuation school program that merged together into a single high school. So those were some mergers that tended to not be, those names might not be as familiar to folks because they didn't really create a lot of controversy. The consolidations, people tended to notice. Kaiser consolidated into Sankofa, Oakland Seoul consolidated into Frick. So that was two different campuses merging, quote unquote merging, but really it was one school got pushed into the other school and they tended not to react very well to that. And then there were actual closures, which is Roots, Parker, and Community Day School, that I think those were the ones where you saw the biggest reaction and the biggest controversy. On the charter school side, there was a consolidation where Roses and Concrete consolidated into Howard to form Oakland Academy of Knowledge, or OAK. And there were a bunch of charter schools that closed. I'm not as familiar with a lot of those stories, but I'm sure they were pretty dramatic for the people involved. And then there were two new schools, neither of them authorized by Oakland Unified, but Orem formed, which is a middle school in Deep East Oakland, and Latitude High School, which was denied by Oakland Unified, denied by Alameda County, and then ended up getting authorized by the state of California. So there's been very few new schools in the past 6 years, just those two, but there's been a bunch of closures and consolidations and mergers. Can you go to the next slide, please? This is just the demographic reality that we're facing in the state of California. Child birth rates have plummeted. You can see, I call it the baby busters, because it's not a baby boom, it's a baby bust. And especially during the pandemic, those lines in yellow towards the end, people were having babies at a way lower rate than we've seen ever before in California. And so there's still a lot of immigration, and Oakland actually has more newcomer students than pretty much any other urban district. But that doesn't even compensate for the number of children that just aren't being born. And so we have an aging population, fewer students, not just in Oakland, across the Bay Area, across California. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so you see these headlines. And when I was at the California School Board Association meeting, convention in December, this past December, they have like lots of little breakout groups for school board members to talk about what's going on in their district. There were 5 different breakout groups. There were like, several dozen of these breakout groups, and 5 of them were about how to handle school closures, school consolidation, school merger conversations, because these enrollment declines are hitting districts up and down the state. And so it's really painful, it's really hard, and yet school districts are talking about it, having to confront these conversations because of fewer students. And, we get funding based on the number of students we have in attendance. So I just wanted to give the context because I think it's a really dramatic history, and going back to the only constant is change, right? And I think we don't know exactly what's going to happen out of all there's no closure list, right? There's not even a merger list. There's no decision that's been reached. We're just in the point of looking at the reality and the fact that a lot of these numbers are going down. And so we haven't yet made a decision as a board around this is going to happen, this isn't going to happen. It's still just in the preliminary stages. But I just think we need to be very aware of the numbers and the history before we even start that conversation. So I'll pass it on now to Vice President Hutchinson, who's going to talk a little bit more about just the history up till now and where do we go from here.
Uh, Thank you, President Davis. And before I start, I apologize. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to be speaking with no visuals. And I think that this is a good place for us to transition between President Davis and myself. You know, we are, before I say anything, um, you know, this is a very charged issue and has been in Oakland and OUSD for the last 20 years. Whenever there is the mention of possible school closures, and it just is a reminder, and for a lot of us, a trigger for some of the traumas that we've faced. The other thing that I really want to stress is we have a real problem with semantics in the language that we use. You know, as we saw in President Davis's presentation, we've had all of these changes over time. Some have been called a closure, some have been called a merger, some have been called this, some have been called that. And it's really, I think, has added to the confusion around where things stand and kind of what our options are to move forward. So to start off, I want to reaffirm what President Davis just said. There are no current plans to close nor consolidate any schools in OUSD. And there's not even a plan currently to merge schools. So there is nothing in the works. There is nothing that there is no action that the school board has taken. You know, the last actions that the school board has taken was a little over a year ago. In January of 23, the school board voted to rescind what had been the school closure plan. After the school board voted to rescind that plan, there is now nothing left on the books pushing forward any of those plans. Last year, also during our budget adjustment phase, we had something that was called mergers, where we had pairs of schools that shared the same school site that were listed as possible mergers going forward. We just heard at our presentation last night around this year's budget adjustments that that item is no longer going to be listed on our budget adjustments. And really during the last year, the school board took no further action to implement that plan. And so as we stand now, there are no plans in the works around any of those things. And in order for a plan to be started, it would take action by the school board. And so I know a lot of times people get very worried about what they might hear or what they think people are talking about behind closed doors. And it's just where things stand now. It will take school board action before anything starts to be planned out and before any process is created. Which brings us a little bit to Assembly Bill 1912. And it's kind of, in my opinion, why this conversation is a little all over the place is because it's really confusing right now. And I'll just say it. I am not very happy about Assembly Bill 1912. And I don't think it's something that applies to OUSD right now. And so for those who don't know, Assembly Bill 1912 was passed last year, a little over a year ago, by the State Assembly. And it was authored by our local assembly member, Mia Bonta, in the wake of I'm sorry, the years blend together for me, in the wake of the 2022 vote by the school board to close schools. And what Assembly Bill 1912 essentially says is, in consideration of school closures and consolidations, that the school district has to engage in an equity impact analysis. Now, this bill only applies to OUSD and one other school district. And again, I don't think it's very supportive of us as a school district in terms of how we need to move forward making our decisions. But explicitly, since we are not currently planning on or considering school closures or consolidations, this is not something that I think we should be engaged in right now. And I really think instead of worrying about metrics for a plan that we haven't even decided we're going to do, we should be really focused as a community on how do we set forward over the next 18 months a citywide conversation to really envision collectively how we need to change and build our district going forward. And I think uh, we're at a real crossroads right now after having stabilized the district over the last few years. And I am really pushing us to, instead of leaping into the next decision, that we really need to take the time to have this community conversation. There's some other aspects about 1912 as well. And so the way we as a school district over the last few months have been receiving a lot of pressure um, by other individuals in the state and other levels of government. You might have seen the press release from the Attorney General's office this week. And really, that pressure is restricting us in our ability to be able to make the decisions that we need to make to move the district forward. So because of the lack of clarity in Assembly Bill 1912 around what school closures or consolidations means, we are now facing roadblocks as a district for some changes that there is no controversy about. For example, we have a school that wants to change from a pre-K and include a TK class as well. So they would be pre-K and TK. In order to do that, it requires changing the school code with the state of California. Currently, we're being told the interpretation of Assembly Bill 1912 restricts us from us being able to do that without going through a lengthy year-long process. We also have things like if we do plan on reconstituting or putting back some of our schools that were broken up into small schools, some people might call it a merger, that we are being restricted from seeing about how to go about it. We are being restricted from entering into that process without going through Assembly Bill 1912 hoops first. And just for context, this is something that we just completed with Highland Elementary last year and Elmhurst the year before, where we merged back or reconstituted back together a school sharing the same campus without controversy. And it's really starting to pay dividends for those school communities now at this point. And so hopefully, as we're starting to move forward, I don't want us to get derailed in an argument about what metrics we should use to determine about school closures before we have these community conversations. I want to really lift up a point of agreement that President Davis and I strongly share around these issues is as a district, we have to look different 3 years from now than we do now. We have to move and change our district. We haven't been allowed to do this as a community in almost 20 years since the state takeover. And there's some fundamental decisions we need to make as a community. There are different theories out there right now on what's the best move to make moving forward, but we really need to have this larger conversation. How do we fund a quality public school in every neighborhood? Do we have a too spread out of a footprint across the district? As we've seen that charter schools are in decline and facing a much larger enrollment decline than our district, is that enough to make up the difference for us? What does a sustainable district look like going forward? These are some of these major questions that we really have to answer over the next few years. And again, I'm hopeful this is the start of us making the 24-25 school year an envisioning year so we can really come to consensus as a community. And I think if we take this pause to really do our due diligence, we'll be able to really start to build the kind of district we all want to see. And so as we start to move into some of the details of the metrics, I really want everyone to hear the framing that both President Davis and I laid out, where we are having these conversations, but we're nowhere near anything being decided. And this is not because we are acknowledging that we have to do this under 1912 now, because school closures are coming up next. And again, I'm going to put my last little 2 cents in before I turn it back over. I'm really hopeful that as a city, we can turn this conversation into projecting forward and really starting to make some of these decisions where the last board really had a policy of what they used to call funding quality. So we saw an expansion of elementary schools that were deemed as the quality schools. What that's left is some other schools very under-resourced. And as a board, we now want to make sure we are equitably spreading our resources across the city and serving all neighborhoods. Are those two ideas compatible? How do we move to a unified policy to really best serve the whole city? Just as one example is hopefully we're starting to think about. So I don't think it was said specifically, but I think we will be doing Q&A later. So I would encourage folks to start putting some questions in the chat now. I think next is going to be a staff presentation of some of the nuts and bolts, and then we will transition back to a Q&A and hopefully move the conversation forward. So that's it from me, and I will turn it over. I don't know if I'm turning it back over to you, President Davis, first. I messed that part up. So who's ever up next, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Vice President Hutchinson. I forgot one of my slides, so I'm just gonna quickly cover that last one and then we'll move on. I just wanted to add, there are lots of places that Vice President Hutchinson and I agree. There's lots of places where we disagree. I think one of the places where we do disagree is maybe because, he's more of a rebel, I'm more of a rule follower. I don't like AB 1912. I feel like it's very poorly written public policy. However, recognizing that it's the law and that we do need to have these conversations, I intend for us to move forward with it and going through all of its steps. And this slide is actually just, again, highlighting one of the consequences if we don't. So again, and this was one of those places where we disagreed, right? Exactly a year ago, the school board voted to rescind the school closures and to not close the 5 schools that we previously voted to close. And so what you saw is literally a month after that, these reductions that you're seeing here on this slide came to the board and were approved by the board and are about to go forward now to school sites. And so schools are facing these per pupil reductions that are really very impactful. We're hearing a lot from the school sites about what the impact is, how inequitable it feels to them that school sites are really losing money. The majority of the money they're losing is for LCFF students, for low-income students, English language learners, and foster students that need the most support. And so it's really a very challenging reduction of $110 per each of those students at every school. And yet, as you know, those were the reductions that we needed basically to do because we didn't move ahead with the school closures. And so if we don't want to see even more drastic cuts in the future, that's why we have to have this conversation. If we don't want to continue seeing our district being spread thinner and thinner across 77 different schools, we have to figure out a way forward to restructure our district. So with that, I will pass it on to the next slide. And I believe that we have some staff from the district office that are going to present just what is AB 1912 and what's the process that we're going to do. These are Jen Korn and Dana Rosenberg, our directors of continuous school improvement. So I'll pass it over to Jen and Dana. Thank you so much.
Thank you, President Davis. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jen Korn. I'm going to start with just a little bit more context about AB 1912, which Director Hutchinson has already spoken to quite a bit, and President Davis as well. And then I'm going to pass it to my colleague Dana Rosenberg to share specifically about the metrics that are under consideration tonight. And just to reiterate that we're hoping that you all will provide feedback on these metrics this evening. We'll be having Q&A and discussion in which you'll be able to provide feedback, and we'll also have a survey link that we'll drop in the chat in a bit where you can provide us written feedback about these proposed metrics. Next slide, Dana. So you've heard a lot. You've heard AB 1912 several times this evening, but we want to hone in on a really key piece of AB 1912, which is that it requires the governing board of the school district to conduct what's called an equity impact analysis anytime school closures or consolidations are being considered. And it's also important to note that there's a 12-month timeline specified by the legislation. So the idea is that the board would vote to approve the metrics and begin the process of conducting an equity impact analysis. And from that point, there would be a maximum of 12 months for the equity impact analysis to be completed and any school closure decisions to be made. Next slide. So this slide is listing the metrics that are required by AB 1912, the state legislation, to be part of the equity impact analysis. Dana's going to go into much more detail about each of these metrics, but we just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware that there are these 9 metrics that are required by the legislation to be included in any equity impact analysis that is conducted. And Dana, I think I'm going to hand it over to you now to talk through each of those metrics and the additional suggested metrics.
Great. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to share. Our directors are looking for your feedback on the metrics, as been previously stated, as per the legislation. And OUSD staff have been invited to outline the metrics so you can give your board members feedback on them. These metrics are outlined by the legislation. The district staff has suggested an additional set of metrics for the board to consider in doing an equity impact analysis. All right, so let's get into it. Section A examines the condition of a school facility by looking at the facility context index, by looking at the facility condition index, excuse me. B, AB 1912B looks at the operating cost of a school and the associated savings resulting from a closure or consolidation. The impact explored looks at the fiscal savings if and when a school is closed or consolidated. C is what spaces on site and in the facilities are potentially not being utilized by students and staff according to the size of the school and the enrollment utilization of the program. D is special programs available at the school, and the legislation is talking about dual language and special ed programs in particular. The goal of the analysis would be to look at the impact on these special programs. For example, if the student would have access to them at other places if a school was closed or consolidated, or if the program could be replicated at another site. Right. E is environmental factors, including but not limited to traffic and proximity to freeway access. For this one, the Cal Environs Pollution Burden Index would be used. And for F, the legislation asks the board to look at the balance of student demographics, including race or ethnicity, students with disabilities, English learners, foster youth, homeless youth in the schools being considered for closure consolidation. The resulting demographic balance of students after placement into another school, or in order to determine if the decision to close or consolidate would have a real disproportionate impact on any particular demographic group. This metric will be explored here, would be the school snapshot of enrollment demographics. Right. So for slides for metrics G, H, and I, these all look at the metrics that would have to be site specific and provided if and when a list of school would be selected by the board. So just want to be really clear that the metrics are really specific to the post of that. So these are 3 required areas. They explore 1, the transportation needs of students, H, aesthetics and the opportunity for blight and negative impact on the surrounding community, and I, the impact on feeder school attendance patterns with the closure of any particular school and whether that said closure will impact attendance at other schools or specialized programs as a result. All right, so these Board members would like your feedback here as well regarding the following potential metrics for the equity impact analysis. And these 4 include a school snapshot of the total enrollment at each school. For that, we would look at enrollment data of the total number of currently enrolled students. The second one here is the rate of enrolled students that live in a neighborhood attendance area of that school. The metric would be the live-go data, the percentage of school-age neighborhood residents who attend the school, the percent of enrolled students who live in a neighborhood, including projected birth rates, and the projected neighborhood birth rates themselves. Number 3 is the demand rate by school, the number of first choice applications divided by the number of students that can support at full capacity. And finally, sustainable school size to implement a community schools model for each grade span. School enrollment compared to the required enrollment for a sustainable community school. Now, I know that's a lot of words, a lot of metrics here. They are available also in a link that Jen Korn is going to put in the chat momentarily if you haven't already. That will have a place for you to put written feedback, and there's a link to these metrics in there as well if you want to keep referring to them. So that concludes my presentation of the metrics that are under consideration for the equity impact analysis that board members are going to be voting on an upcoming meeting as they shared previously. So let us know your questions and feedback in the chat. And again, alternatively, use the form so you can fill out to provide feedback. So I think the mic will go back to President Davis and Vice President Hutchinson to field questions, and we'll be lifting up the questions from the chat if you have them. Thank you.
I think I'm gonna jump in. Dana, can you close the thank you. Perfect. The slide deck. So I'm going to facilitate the Q&A section here. If you have questions or feedback about the metrics that you'd like to voice in the meeting, we encourage you to use the raise your hand function. And we look forward to hearing from you. I do see that there's one question in the chat, which is asking, is there a reason why California school dashboard metrics are not on this list, student group performance and growth? Directors Davis and Hutchinson, I don't know if you want to speak to including or not including student achievement metrics for this equity impact analysis.
So I encourage everyone to give their feedback. You know, I think this is a difficult conversation when we start getting into these details like this. You know, when we look at the list of considerations, of course, all of these things should be considered if that's the road that the district is going down. But we haven't decided to close schools. We haven't decided what's driving these issues, and so. Yes, that should be looked at, but when you look at that whole list in its entirety, it's a very difficult process to go through, and I think it highlights what's been faulty about the process of closing schools in the past in OUSD. So yes, we should always look at academic outcomes as one of the factors. It's very important that we can provide the best academic outcomes as possible for our students. But again, as we are going to look at this in its entirety, it does become a difficult issue. And just the last thing that list doesn't highlight, which I think you know, academic performance is a factor in, is we're also in a choice system. And so in a lot of ways, what we're going to be looking at through this analysis are the factors that drive families to make certain choices, but also there would need to be a real need to look at the ultimate impacts of those decisions at the back end.
Yeah, I would say as much as I hear the concern about, you know, looking at, I think oftentimes the dashboard indicators end up reflecting test scores. And I think since we have neighborhood schools, a lot of that has to do with the socioeconomics of the neighborhood. Because the neighborhood, you know, that test scores are often very reflective of socioeconomics, and socioeconomics is often very reflective of the neighborhood where the school is located. But what I do want to say is, and you know, I didn't develop these metrics. I think these were the ones recommended by staff, and the feedback that I've given to staff is that, you know, we also really need to include something that evaluates what's the impact on equity within the district if we don't make these changes. You know, we see schools being underfunded. We see the impact, like I said earlier, of the reduction to supplemental per pupil funds to school sites. And so if we don't do these any kind of changes to the number of schools, then what will be the impact? And what will be the impact on the equity that we're able to provide across different schools? So yeah, that would be my comment.
Thank you, Director Davis and Director Hutchinson. I don't see any further questions or comments in the chat at this time. I'm wondering if there's anyone who is interested in sharing your feedback.
I'll try to prime the pump a little bit, so to
Great.
speak. The last exchange really highlights the differences and the similarities between President Davis and I. You know, we do have some real issues that we're looking at in terms of how do we figure out how to structure the district going forward. President Davis has been very consistent in lifting up the issue that he really feels like we have too many schools, which spreads our scarce resources too thinly across the district. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just really approaching it, I think, the same issue just from a different angle, where I am really focused on us trying to create a community conversation to help inform how we make these decisions. In the end, it's probably going to be a combination of these two things. If we can have the right kind of community conversation, I trust the community, and I'm sure the consensus coming out of that will help us build a more equitable district and an equitable spreading of our resources. So I just want to point out that although that might sound like we're saying very different things, it's very, very similar. And I'm hopeful that through this process, we can kind of start to, as a community, put all of these ideas together into one policy moving forward.
Thanks, Director Hutchinson. I see that Kim Davis has a hand raised, and then we're starting to get some lively comments in the chat, so I'll start to bring those into the room. Kim.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, President Davis and Vice President Hutchinson for having this meeting. One thing that immediately jumps out at me is that these are the same metrics that were shown at the last board meeting and are not at all responsive to the concerns that were raised in the Attorney General's letter that was written in response to that presentation. And specifically, it says that the process and metrics described in the documents that we just looked at meet AB 1912's minimum requirements. However, we remain concerned that OUSD has added metrics, live-go data, demand rate, enrollment size, sustainable school size, and may analyze others, A through D of 1912, in a way that will lead to an outcome that mirrors the February 8th closure decision. So I think that we need to take seriously that if we are going to do the 1912 analysis, we need to take seriously the guidance that was written specifically in response to the metrics that we just looked at. And so they need to be a little bit different. As to the question of, you know, we need to have fewer schools or we don't need to have fewer schools, it has long been my feeling that if we decide that we need to have fewer schools, then we need to do this process differently. And it doesn't feel like we're doing it very differently. We aren't talking about the fact that we are a choice district that provides no transportation. So there are entire swaths of communities that don't have a choice as a result of that. We don't talk about the fact that our choice system is not a true choice system because we have priorities. And for those schools that tend to be the highest demand schools as measured by the demand rates, those are mostly neighborhood families that have access to those schools. And so that isn't, that is not equity. That is not at all what we should be looking at, in my opinion. So if we decide we have to close schools or even merge or consolidate schools, I think we need to look beyond what we've looked at in the past, and make sure that we're providing options for families who don't have a lot of choice to start off with, because I think that we haven't done that. We have not considered how this is going to impact the people that live across the street from the school and have limited transportation, or parents that work or whatever. We want kids to be able to go to school. And if we're closing their neighborhood school and they have no other options, that no longer is an option for them. I have more to say, as you all know, but I'm gonna stop for now. Thank you.
Thanks for your feedback, Kim. Director Davis and Director Hutchinson, do you want to respond to that, or do you want me to throw you some other questions from the chat?
I just wanted to respond to one part very quickly. I strongly disagree with the Attorney General. I don't agree with that characterization of his press release this week. That came after the school board decided we were not going to negotiate with them, and it was filled with inaccuracies. And so if the Attorney General or Assemblymember Bonta, or anyone else for that matter, wants to help and support us in OUSD as we're trying to go through a process to figure out how to build our district going forward, we welcome their support. But press releases and negative spin in the media is not something that's helpful to us as a community. And just secondly, as somebody who experienced school closures in 2012 and has fought tirelessly against them since that point, I'm here to say things are very different in OUSD these days.
President Davis, you're on mute if you're trying to talk to us.
Thanks. I would second that. I think, there are a lot of challenges with choice. I don't think it's true that we don't talk about the challenges of being a choice. I think we talk about a lot. It's just very hard to do anything about it. We had a whole enrollment working group that looked at different options. But the context is that we are an urban district surrounded by suburban districts with a very strong charter sector. And so if we restrict choice in OUSD, we're basically amplifying people's choice to go to neighboring districts by using, whether they use, family members or however they get their kids into a neighboring district. We have folks going to charter schools. And so it's very hard for us unilaterally to restrict choice within OUSD when we are an urban district surrounded by suburban districts. And so when we have people in suburban districts sending us press releases, writing laws about us, it's just very challenging because I don't see people suggesting merging Alameda and Oakland and Piedmont and Emeryville and having, desegregation across multiple districts. And so we within Oakland are trying to solve our problems, but it's within the context of being a district that faces a lot of poverty, that has students that other districts around us don't want, and there's tremendous amount of unfairness that we're trying to overcome here within.
Thank you, Director Davis and Director Hutchinson. I want to lift up, there's a question in the chat sort of about process and timeline. Are there recommendations for school closure coming in May? Is that happening or not? Why are Director Davis and Director Hutchinson saying two different things about whether school closures are coming or not? Can you all speak to what people can expect in terms of process over the upcoming months?
I can jump into that. So I don't think we're saying different things. I think we're just being very clear that nothing has been decided yet. And it takes a vote of the school board to make any decision. And under AB 1912, we have to go through a process. So we're starting that process. Staff are bringing recommendations, but we as a board have to vote on them. And so it's up to staff to bring those recommendations to the board. And then it's up to us as a board to make a decision. So the proposal I heard from staff at the last meeting was that they did want to move forward with this process. They did recommend it, and they recommended that they would bring forward recommendations for closures and consolidations and mergers in May. And so that's the timeline that we're on, but nothing has been decided yet. The board has not taken any action.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you know, and if something does come forward, then people can defer to their knowledge of the school board directors and how they're likely to vote, whether something is brought forward by staff or not.
Thank you both. I think I want to direct us now to, well, there's a question that you might be able to respond to about Measure Y projects and how, whether there should be consideration of Measure Y projects when looking at the equity impact analysis or making decision about school closures. Would either of you like to speak to that?
I don't
Yeah, go ahead.
I was waiting for I don't think directly, but you know, when we see the list on the equity impact analysis, when they start to talk about facilities and the condition of the facilities, those were some of the same determinations that were made to develop the Measure Y priority list. And so, you know, the other thing with just the way the question is framed, you know, most of our schools receive some funding through Measure Y in some sort of facility upgrades. But you know, the way this is laid out, facility condition and upkeep is definitely a factor that's listed on this impact analysis for 1912.
Yeah, I think that's right. And nothing to add.
Great. Sorry, I was posting our links one more time in the chat. I want to bring your attention to there's some questions about, well, there's a question, Director Hutchinson, for you about the Elmhurst and the Highland mergers, which the person putting this in the chat says that you mentioned that you considered those to have been relatively controversy-free and to be paying dividends. Can you expand on that? What do you mean by that?
I don't have much to expand on that. You know, as those school sites went through that process, those sites were not there were not protests there. There was not community pushback along that. It was uncomfortable at the start bringing two sites together, but they have been largely positive outcomes. And you know, the reason why I really want to hold those up is when Kaiser Elementary was closed, the district called it a merger and merging into Sankofa. And this is a problem with these language. And so the best way I can answer this is the first time I had a meeting with Superintendent Johnson Trammell in her office when she first became the superintendent. We went to the map on the wall in her office and she started talking about her ideas. Some of them were closing schools. And I said, I would never be supportive of that. Some of it was reconstituting our schools that have been broken up and share our campus. So like on a campus like Highland, where resources are scarce, it made a lot of sense to bring the two campuses on Highland back together into Highland Elementary like it was originally built. And because we haven't seen those families showing up at school board meetings or protests or outrage because of it, it has been a successful transition. And that's what I was just trying to reference by those two sites.
I want to build on that with, there's sort of a lively back and forth in the chat right now about whether AB 1912 applies to mergers of two schools that are on the same site. I know that you both have opinions about that. Would you like to speak to that question?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm not a lawyer and, you know, I can't say what the law says, but to me, it very clearly says in AB 1912 closures and consolidations, and it doesn't mention mergers. And so I think I did want to also say just to the, you know, I totally hear that the process at Lockwood and at Elmhurst was very, very challenging, and it was, you know, not controversy free. There was plenty of controversy, right? I don't think that's what Vice President Hutchinson was saying. I think you didn't see the kind of community pushback, the level of protests over those. They were very difficult transitions, and I think it's one of the opportunities that we have now where we do have some of the COVID relief funds and the one-time funds to support transitions more sustainably than we did in, you know, previous rounds when, you know, when Superintendent Johnson Trammell started in Oakland, it was a financial crisis. Their backs were against the wall. They were having to make changes without a lot of resources to support those changes. And right now is the time to do that because we do have the resources rather than waiting until it is another crisis and our backs are again against the wall. And then we're doing it again with, you know, on fumes. So I just think that that's important to think about. But yeah, I think that AB 1912 really came out of the response to the closures that were voted on 2 years ago. And so, you know, when you're merging schools on one site, every classroom is still going to be a classroom, right? It's not the situation where you're like, okay, you're suddenly going to have a vacant. All the signs that went up said Oakland not for sale, right? When you have two schools merging on one site, there's not even any change in the property that the district has that's vacant. So
yeah, I totally agree with that. And you know, the 1912 is very specific in mentioning closures or consolidations. And I think one of the things we're trying to do right now as a district across the board is to get clarity on the definition of 1912 and what exactly that phrase is going to entail for us.
Great, thank you both. I want to draw your attention to a couple of questions and comments in the chat about how district schools are treated versus how charter schools are treated. There's one comment that says it would be great to use common metrics, both AB 1912, which refers to district schools, and AB 1505, which is charter school legislation, and is 100% driven by the California School Dashboard inputs, having two drastically different measures in this person's estimation is inequitable, and they'd like to see a singular community conversation for both consolidation mergers and charter renewals. And then there's another comment kind of responding to that that says that sort of pushes back on that notion because the district doesn't have the power to make decisions about the locations of charter schools. So they're sort of two different considerations. I'm wondering if either of you would like to speak to that question about how we make sensible and effective decisions about the size and location of our district schools versus how decisions are made about charter renewal, et cetera.
I'll just say very quickly, there are two entirely separate things. And so, no, we are not combining those two things together. Assembly Bill 1505 has worked really well for OUSD. You know, when President Davis put up his slide earlier showing the decline in charter school enrollment since 2017-18, I would link that to the passage of Assembly Bill 1505. And unfortunately, Gavin Newsom has not allowed us to do charter renewals for the last few years. And so we are prepared to do charter renewals for the first time under Assembly Bill 1505 next year. And it's two entirely different set of standards because charter schools are not public schools.
yeah, nothing to add there.
Great, thank you. There's a question in the chat about whether we are in financial crisis currently. If we are making across the board school site budget cuts, that seems like a financial crisis is the comment.
I think if people were around in 17-18, there were mid-year cuts, and you know, I was laid off in 2011, so you know there were massive teacher pink slipping in 2011. I mean, I think yes, it's the degree of crisis in Oakland is always a relative term, right? but I think in Oakland, we've seen some really serious situations. Right now, what we're trying to do is make course corrections with our eyes on where are we going to be 2 or 3 years from now. We're not worried about can we pay our bills this year. So that's, I think, the difference between, you know, maybe that would be considered a crisis in another district, but I think for Oakland, it feels pretty good compared to where we've been in previous years.
Yeah, I agree. And I think last night at our study session, Lisa Grant Dawson, our chief business officer, said it really well, because she puts back on whether it's a crisis or not, because I like saying we're no longer in crisis. You know, it is, things are very tight for us, but we have enough for this year and next year. The question is, if we are not careful, we can run into trouble again in year 3. And so you know, I'll let other people determine if that qualifies as a crisis or not.
Thank you both. There's a sort of technical question here in the chat that I think I'll give you a break and I'll respond to quickly, which is, can we get clarification about, quote, required enrollment for a sustainable community school, which is one of the additional 4 proposed metrics that we're seeking feedback about. The idea behind that metric is that there would be a calculation that says this is the required number of students in order to bring in the ADA revenue to support the services that we want to have at a school site in order to provide full service community school services. And the metric would be where that school's enrollment is in relation to that threshold of required enrollment in order to support the services that we would want to provide. So that's the metric that's been proposed, and we're seeking your feedback about whether that is a metric that should be considered or not. Do either of you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I think that speaks to my question around what's the impact of not closing or consolidating or merging schools. Because what we currently have is a large number of what I call micro schools that are fewer than like about 220 students. And just by their nature, those schools to remain open end up taking a lot of resources from other schools around the district. And that would be one thing if those schools were then having great results for students, but it's not providing a wonderful environment for students. It's just basically keeping the lights on, running a school that's very small. And that ends up draining resources from other schools. And so I think that's where you have an impact of sustaining this number of schools, 77 schools, that's inequitable across the district.
And just a little broader context. I don't think we've all had a full understanding of just how devastated the district has been, just in the way it functions and in coherent policies, really since the state takeover. And so as we're having some of these conversations, the district is lacking a lot of things. For one, as a district, we have never approved a base staffing formula that we want to see for our schools. We have a number of, we know how many teachers per students, but we've never approved a staffing list that says every school should have this, and this. And so we've wound up with this patchwork system across the district. And then that dovetails now into these conversations of what's sustainable, what size schools we need to have. And so this is some of the work that hopefully we'll be doing over the next 18 months, because in my opinion, it's hard for us to make some of these decisions out of order or kind of in the abstract. And so I think this is, I don't think, President Davis, we said it explicitly enough at the start. This is the first of all the school board directors having some form of town halls around this issue, and then the very beginning of this conversation. So one of the things I really appreciate just in the questions that are being brought up, it's really highlighting some of the many areas we need to really do some more work around, before we're ready to bring back and incorporate it into a larger analysis as well.
Director Davis and Director Hutchinson, it's 7:06. There are a few more comments in the chat. Well, here's a big question that is in the chat that maybe I'll offer to you, and then let me know if you want to keep going or if you want to wrap it up. But there's a question in the chat about how do you know that closing small schools will improve budget and student outcomes? I think this is a question for you, President Davis.
Yeah, I think, I think if we look at, and as I said, I have really, really strong concerns about the school closures under Randy Ward and Tony Smith. I feel like those were very inequitable, and you saw, as people have said time and time again, right? A lot of those campuses, the public school closed and a charter school opened in its place, right? And so I think the impact on equity there was really negative. But I think if you look at the school mergers, consolidations, and closures since Superintendent Johnson Trammell came in, as much as I have issue with a lot of the process and some of the things that happened at the time, but you see at Parker, you have adult education and community services. At Kaiser, you have a preschool hub, right? At Santa Fe had been closed under Tony Smith, but it's now a special education department. You see Sankofa, as much as I've heard people have the nerve to say that Sankofa is less equitable now, I actually think it's actually serving, because it's really been adopted as our neighborhood school for my section of North Oakland. Like, it's a thriving school. It's probably has a larger number of African-American students than when it was really severely under-enrolled in the past. It has new African-American leadership, longtime African-American staff that are in leadership positions. I think it's actually doing really well, considering as much as it was not set up to succeed, by the way, it was set up with Kaiser merging into it. And so I think, there's, as much as, the Roots closure was super problematic the way it was carried out, and yet I do hear from principals in the neighborhood that now being able to send students to CCPA is going really well for those students. And so I think if you look at the record since 2017, as much as there were big bumps in the road and there were not enough resources to support the transitions, but now, where we are right now, I think a lot of those transitions have worked out for the best for the district.
So it's about 7:10. Do you want me to keep drawing out some of the comments in the chat, or do you want to make some final comments? And we'll, of course, download all the chat, and it will be incorporated into all the feedback that the board will be considering.
Yeah, I did see a couple of questions. So I saw one question: why isn't this meeting being held in person?
Thank you.
I think, it's always a difficult choice to hold a meeting in person or on Zoom. Just given, our resources, we get a small stipend, it's hard for us to organize things as school board members. So this was put on us as, like, for school board members to go out and do public engagement. So this was what was feasible for us with the resources that we have. But we do also have the school board meetings, and so those are in person, and people are welcome to come and make public comment there. I saw another question just about are we making cuts to central administration? And I think we really have. There's been a lot over the past few years. There's more proposed for this year. But what we've really seen is there's a point, where when we propose cuts to administration, for example, there's proposed cuts to central interpreters, to central Office of Equity, staff, we hear from people like, no, those services are really, really important to the schools. And so it's just always a difficult balance between whenever people are always like, cut central office. And then when a cut is proposed, people are like, well, no, not them. Those are the people that we really depend on. And so I think that becomes a really challenging place where we need a certain amount of infrastructure to operate the number of schools that we have. And those go hand in hand. And so I think when you look at some of the cuts to the buildings and grounds office that were made, right, that really harmed our schools. And so then we had to restore them. So I think everything's on the table. It always is. And we are taking a look at all aspects, but the central office is actually a relatively small part of the district compared to when we have 77 schools.
I would just encourage everyone to come to the Budget and Finance Committee meeting where we do have deeper conversations. And this is the thing that, I actually appreciate how well this has gone so far, especially with all the history that a lot of us have around these issues. I think as we're starting to move forward as a district, I think we need to be careful we don't conflate certain things, especially from the past. And so we are not in a situation now where we are in financial crisis and the school board has determined the only way out of it is to close schools. And so, and a discussion about what's the best way out of it. That's just not the situation that we're at right now. And so what we are trying to determine over the next 2 to 3 years is how do we restructure, redesign our district to better serve our communities equitably going forward. And of that, one of the questions might be changing our footprint as a district. And I just don't want to let it go with what President Davis brought up about Kaiser, Roots, and Parker. All things that I fought very strongly against. And now if we look at it now, all 3 of those sites are housing OUSD and community services. And so if we are now at a point as a district where we are determining that we have better or more pressing uses for our scarce resources and facilities, how do we create a process to get there? And when I look at what's happening at Kaiser Elementary now, which is a really good outcome for that site, I have to think, is there a way that we could have gotten to this point differently than what was done in the past without creating a divisive process, maybe even creating a process where the community has an opportunity to weigh in and buy into the decisions that we make collectively. And I think in the barest essence, that's what we're really trying to move to. And those are the questions that we're starting to ask now.
I just wanted to lift up, I saw a really good question from Mona in the chat about tracking students who went through cohort 1, cohort 2, the latest round of closures. And so I'm wondering, is that something that I would like to recommend that be something that staff looks at, because I know that it was frustrating when we were having these conversations and I was in the community in 2018, 19, and the staff response was about 2012 was like, oh, well, we don't have any data from back then. But I think at this point we probably do. And so I think that would be really useful to bring into the conversation.
Yeah, we appreciate that feedback. I also wanted to respond to the question, is there a deadline for survey submission? We're going to be conducting several of these town halls over the next couple of weeks. I would encourage folks to submit your survey by February 15th. Was there anything else in the chat that I missed? I know that I was trying to pump up the survey over and over again. Hopefully everyone has seen the link for the survey in English and in Spanish. And I hope that you will take a moment to offer your feedback in writing on the survey. Some additional comments keep coming in. Do you want me to keep voicing them?
I think I can address that last one in closing. Do we want to kind of wrap it up? And
It's 7:15. I think we could wrap it up.
okay,
President Davis, you wanted me to go first and you can bring it home at the end?
sounds good.
Okay. I again, I want to thank everyone for participating. Please share around the survey. I think my feelings around some of these issues are fairly well known. I really don't think this is the way that we should be going about this as a district, and I'm not very happy about Assembly Bill 1912. But more than that, I hope everyone recognizes how much the district has changed because the community has spoken. You know, as a community, during the last 4-year election cycle, we elected 7 new school board directors, largely around these very issues. We also elected a new county superintendent. Last year, the board voted to rescind the school closures plan. And so there are no plans in the works to close schools. That's just not what's happening right now. But we do have to figure out how to create a community process so we can figure out a way to decide some of these pressing, larger structural issues we have as a district. We have not had full local control in 20 years now. And in that time, we've had decisions imposed on us after decision imposed on us. This is hopefully the start of us figuring out how we work our way out of it. I'm very determined not to let us fall back to the old ways of doing things because I don't think they worked for us. And so hopefully, again, going forward, I'm going to ask everyone to trust us, to trust the choices you've made in electing new school board directors, and please help us in coming together so we can have this community conversation. And it can't be, what about this from 4 years ago? Or what about this that some person said 6 years ago? We have made huge changes in this district in the last 2 years. We have a 2-year window, this opportunity to really move things forward. And if we miss this opportunity to finally come together and build the district we want, it'll be our fault this time. And so please, if it requires suspending some disbelief, if it requires you showing up and being angry, however you need to get there, we have to get this done in the next 18 months. At that point, we'll probably be looking at a new superintendent. And if we don't make changes in 18 months from now, we could be in a position where we do have to look at mid-year cuts. You know, we are looking at going into deficit spending next year to extend this transition time that we have. And thankfully, we got $300 million almost in COVID relief. But we have to make structural changes. Our district is not the same. Our city is not the same as it was 20 or 30 years ago. And we are asking you to join us in that process to help us figure that out.
Thank you, Vice President Hutchinson. Yeah, thanks to everybody. I know this is not an easy conversation. It's I see someone saying press the restart building and restart button. And I think that's right. I think that's what we're trying to do. I think people fought very hard to elect different school board members, and here we are in the seats that we're in, and we have new school board members sitting next to us, and they're seeing the same numbers that we are. And so we're, as Mike says, we're not in a crisis, and what we're telling you is we're trying to avert a crisis. And so we do have to have this conversation. I agree. I don't like the way AB 1912 is structured. It's not my ideal process, but it's the process that the state has told us we have to go through. And so at least that is the starting point. And I think we can build upon it as we go through it. The timeline would be under the timeline that staff laid out. There would be no changes for 2025. This would be taking effect in August of 2020. No, am I getting the numbers wrong? It would be taking place in August of 2025 would be the changes. So when Mike says 18 months, that's the time period that we're talking about, is really 18 months from now. And so I think we do get to use AB 1912 as the starting point because it's the law. And then we have to build on it from there and see what else we want to add to it. And so I think I did see one last question about how many schools do we need to close? And people always come to us and they say, who's on the list? What schools are on the list? And the whole point of what Vice President Hutchinson and I've been saying tonight, there is no list. This is the process where we start to build the list by using the metrics to determine what schools need to go through some kind of transformation, what schools need to merge, and what schools need to be consolidated. And so as we go through that process, we need to hear from the community. You might not always agree with what we say. We might not always agree with you, but we have to figure out how to do this together. And so with that, yeah, I'm not on staff. And so the role of the board is to hear the staff recommendations and to vote on them. And so we'll wait and see what staff recommends to us, and then we can move from there. So with that, if there's any other closing words, I think we'll thank you all and wish you all a good night.
I just want to say a closing word, which is that I put the survey in the chat one last time. Please take a moment to click the survey link and share your written feedback about the metrics. And again, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you. Good night.